Right, hello everyone. It's just after 9 a.m. in the UK, so we'll get started. So welcome to our latest Survey Methods webinar, which is organised by City, the University of London, the European Social Survey, and NatCen Social Research. My name's Tim Hanson, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at European Social Survey headquarters, and I'll be introducing today's session. The session today is held at an earlier time than usual, as our speaker is based in Australia. So we're very happy to welcome Ben Edwards to present today, and particular thanks, Ben, for giving up part of your evening. I think it's 7 p.m. or so there. So Ben is an Associate Professor and Senior Fellow at the Australian National University Centre for Social Research and Methods, where he focuses on policy-relevant research on children and youth development. He's also co-editor of the Australian Journal of Social Issues, project director of the Australian subnational data collection of the Oxford Government Response Tracker, and he's led the data collection of the Australian Social Survey International ESS. And today, Ben is going to present on measuring disasters, the role of self-report surveys, geospatial linkage, and citizen science approaches. He'll discuss the approaches taken on a range of studies and also reflect on recent developments in this area, including responses to the pandemic. Ben's going to talk for around 45 minutes, and there'll be time for questions at the end. If you do have any questions, please type these in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom, so that use a Q&A rather than a chat if you can, and I will then ask Ben the questions once we've finished. We'll be done by in about an hour, so 10 a.m. in the UK, and over to Ben.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the seminar. Thanks very much for inviting me. What I'm going to do today really is make the case for why measuring natural disasters through self-report is important and informative and worthwhile. I'll share some experiences from a program of research that I've been conducting for well over a decade. I'll just share my screen now and bring up my slides. So this work is joint work that's been conducted over, as I said, over a decade with colleagues at the ANU, as well as colleagues with support from the Australian Institute of Family Studies, Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, Medical Research Future Fund, and many others, including the United Nations as well. And it spans countries and time periods. This is some results from the latest IPCC report looking at how global warming leads to increased natural disaster exposures and what we might expect with continued increases in global temperature warming. And so we can see here that the 10 and 50-year events are increasing as the temperature rises. This also applies when we're talking about rainfall and also droughts, and both ecological and agricultural droughts. So as I said previously, what I really want to do today is just share some experiences, show some of the techniques, and show some of the benefits with you collecting self-reported information about natural disaster exposures from large-scale surveys. I'll be providing examples of that in the context of the 2007 Australian Millennium Drought, some work in the Philippines, and some more recent work looking at the 2019-2020 bushfires in Australia, and also the pandemic. The work from the Australian Millennium Drought, there's been several papers that have been published around this. A couple of the more relevant ones are listed below. Essentially, at the time that we were conducting this research, we were at the height of the longest drought for many, many years, one of the most significant droughts in Australian history, the 2007, what's referred to as Millennium Drought, which was just at the beginning of our understanding of the fact that there was global warming occurring and increases in climate change natural disasters. And as you can see from this map, there was increases in temperature changes in the central and east of Australia, which was the sort of southeast in particular. That eastern seaboard is an area is where a large proportion of our agricultural land is located. You can see that that area is also where at the time Australia was also becoming a lot drier. In this context, we will look. There's comparison is with historical averages going back to 1950 for that particular area. There's variation in rainfall across the continent, natural variation, and cropping and farming practices vary across Australia in line with that. But what we're talking about when we're talking about rainfall deficits here is in the context of the historical average for that particular area. And that brings me to one of the challenges in measuring drought. There's not a great deal of consensus in terms of measuring drought. When we started this work, we were very surprised that this was the case. And there are different ways in which people look at drought. And as social scientists, we were sort of quite shocked, actually. And so, as I mentioned before, meteorological drought or rainfall drought is the degree of and duration of dryness compared to an average for the area. Hydrological drought is based on changes in the water supply. Agricultural usually takes into account 1 and 2 and looks at the agricultural impacts and takes into account soil moisture deficits. And a social definition is really based on personal experience from above. At the time in which we were doing this work, drought was defined as a 1 in 20-year event. And so what we did is we ran what's referred to as the Regional and Rural Family Study. Was a random digital survey of 8,000 interviews in agricultural areas in Australia, stratified by rainfall in the last 3 years compared to the last 100 years, with stratification for those who are in severe drought. So these are percentiles, the very, very high degree of rainfall deficits, moderate, below average and above average rainfall. And you can see the density in the rainfall percentiles in those respondents in the graph below. So we were oversampling those agricultural areas that had high levels of drought. We defined drought for the purposes of this project using linked area information about rainfall. And we also asked people about whether they were in drought. So are they currently in drought? They've been in the last year, but not currently. What about the last 3 years and have not been in drought in the last 3 years? You can see the percentages there. So, and with an oversample, a portion who were reporting currently in drought, but in our sample survey, we found 60%. That was weighted data. In terms of the social definition of drought, where we got to with this, and we struggled with this over many years about how to best operationalize it. One of the things that where we've come to with this is to make use of neighbourhood or neighbours' perceptions of drought to provide an aggregate level at a particular postcode or area. And we did that primarily because in our multi-level random intercept models, we found a very high degree of agreement about the extent of drought in the area. So an intra-class correlation coefficient of 0.57. I'll talk more about what we've done with that in later studies. And this, of course, is highly correlated with the rainfall definition of drought, but it doesn't fully overlap. Here's a random effects logistic regression with being in current drought compared to not being in current drought by rainfall. And you can see that those who have severe or moderate rainfall deficits are significantly more likely to be reporting to be in current drought. But it's not a one-to-one. There's more information that's being contained in this social definition. And the more information that's contained in this social definition of drought, which is aggregated, remember, at that area level, provides a more sensitive measure to sort of pick up on the social and economic impacts. So here we see self-reported experiences of financial hardship in the last 12 months, by meteorological drought and self-report. You can see the differences in the distributions there. And then also when we break this down by the type of employment that people are in at the time, with farmer, farm worker, those who are employed but not in agricultural, and those who are employed, you can see that the percentages of people who report being in currently in drought in the farmer group is far greater for the no drought in the last 3 years. There's a differential for the no drought in the last 3 years, whereas for those who are farmers, according to the rainfall, it doesn't really pick up that experience so well. So we feel like we felt at the time that the social definition of drought was a much more nuanced way to pick up people's actual experiences of drought, given that it's a very slow moving event and there's a lot of nuance there. So this brings, so on the basis of, we've done a lot of further work where we've looked at the impacts of that on many social and mental health measures, and I'm happy to discuss that in detail. Broadly speaking, we find the social definition of drought as being far more sensitive in terms of picking up social and economic impacts. So on that basis, we've also done work looking at a completely different context, the Philippines. The Philippines is an interesting context in which to do research when one's interested in natural disasters, because they have very high rates of natural disasters, particularly cyclones or typhoons, every year. And so the proportion of the number of people who are affected and by these typhoons is very high, but they also have a broad range of other natural disasters, including volcanoes, earthquakes, and flooding as well. And so it's a good context in which, if you're interested in looking at disaster exposures, to work in. And I've had the pleasure of being able to be involved in a national child cohort in the Philippines, where we've collected extensive information about drought exposure. A couple of recent papers are listed below. And what I really want to talk about here is considering the impact of exposure to multiple natural disasters. You recall at the beginning of the talk, I talked about the increased rate of natural disasters as a result of climate change that people will experience. And across the life course, this is likely to mean that individuals are going to experience multiple and not a singular exposure to a significant natural disaster. There's not, as far as we're aware, any sort of standard technique for quantifying multiple natural disasters over time. Most studies simply look at one exposure to one natural disaster as an exogenous shock, but not necessarily multiple. And what we do in this particular set of work is we refine our aggregation strategy using a technique referred to as ecometrics, which has been well established when looking at developing up measures of neighbourhood social capital by Rob Sampson and Steve Raudenbush back in 1997. And this builds on work that our group's been doing. A little bit about the longitudinal cohort. It's a prospective longitudinal survey of a nationally representative sample of 10-year-old children, including their caregivers. 4,952 households were interviewed in wave one, which was a few years ago now. It's about 4 years ago now. And information about a lot of the Sustainable Development Goal indicators is included in this survey. So it's quite unique in that way. And surveys have been collected or conducted of caregivers, primarily the mother, and also studied children, as well as community leaders as well, referred to as barangays, which literally means village in Tagalog. And how natural disasters is collected in this particular longitudinal study is through asking caregivers, has there been any of the following hazards or danger in your neighbourhood since 2003? So that was in the last 3 years. So, tropical cyclone, extreme rainfall, drought, and so on. So that's a very long list. And so there's a binary yes, no, and then the type of damage that was conducted. We're just going to focus on disaster exposure for the purposes of today's talk. And the other thing to note is that the community leaders were also asked this same set of questions. And so what I want to do today is just talk you through some of the validation work we've done with looking at this measure of multiple natural disasters. Here you can see the distribution as reported by the primary caregiver in the household from 2013 to 17 when the survey was conducted, and the median being about 3 natural disasters in the last 3 years, which is quite a lot. What we did with this self-report data at the household level is aggregate up to the area level using that econometric technique, which is essentially you looking at the neighbourhood variance in the outcome measure divided by that same neighbourhood variance, but plus the take into account the number of individuals in the neighbourhood. An advantage, the distributions below, an advantage of this particular technique is that the information that we're using and how we construct it is simply an aggregate measure of all the neighbours, but not the individual themselves. What we found, though, was that we were able to estimate these neighbourhood levels of community reports of natural disasters very reliably on the basis of this neighbourhood reliability measure at 0.89. We also had linked information from the International Disasters Database around the number of disasters experienced for a longer time period as well, which we've made use of to look at validation of this particular indicator. You can see here a couple of graphs. So the individual household self-report with the average community report, you can see there's a very high correlation there, 0.55 in the table below. Importantly, though, the average community report measure, the econometric measure, has a much stronger correlation with the MDAT data, that objective measure, of 0.42 than this individual household self-report. Not only does it have a stronger correlation, but it's also more sensitive than other types of measures in natural disasters. So here we have the relationship between household income and average community reports. And you can see there's a pattern and shape to that for the average community report, but not so much for the MDAT natural disasters for the International Disaster Database. When we look at caregiver and child outcomes, so family frequency of family violence in the last 12 months, which is a continuous measure of perceived stress, and then some binary measures, so family violence in the last 12 months, whether the child had witnessed violence, whether the child reported being hurt or hurt forcefully, child stunting as measured by interviewers, and reports of severe food insecurity as measured by the UN official food insecurity scale. You can see that there's much higher rates or odds of being exposed to those negative outcomes when the average neighbourhood report is used compared to the MDAT report. We did look at household individual reports and they weren't as strongly related. I'm not reporting that here today, but you can look in the paper and see that pattern. So the key points from these sets of studies is really that you can develop up a reliable measure of neighbourhood disaster exposure. It tends to be more strongly associated with other disaster indicators in individual reports, and also social and economic outcomes. And so that's quite promising when we're thinking about how we can monitor disaster exposures. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about bushfires. And then, and I'm moving very quickly, much quicker than I thought. And then have a bit of, and have a little bit more, have a bit of a, more of a discussion at the end about what we might do in future. So next I want to talk about an extension of the work that we've been doing in the Philippines using the longitudinal study of Australian children. which is a national study. It's similar to Millennium cohort study. And so in this context, we're also looking at multiple natural disasters, but with a specific focus around bushfires. So in this particular cohort study, there's 9 waves of data. There's a pandemic or coronavirus set of information that was collected in 2020 and 2021. The data has only been released for 2020 at this stage. And there's self-reported information around bushfires and more in-depth natural disasters information around the period of the pandemic as well. And so what we're doing here, is making use of that data. What I want to report on today is some of the more detailed analysis we've done with looking at many different types of natural disasters in this particular cohort. Another important feature, which is critical when we're considering the viability and feasibility of asking individual respondents about natural disasters, is the age of the cohort members. So in waves 4 to 8, the caregivers are reporting on natural disaster exposure. But in wave 9, the young people themselves are the primary reporters of disaster exposure. So we've been able to look and see whether or not natural disasters can be reported on by young people as young as 16 years of age. So what we ask a series of questions around natural disasters, which are really exposure questions. So have you been affected by any of the following extreme weather events or natural disasters in the past 12 months? And then it's simply just an exposure question. So bushfires, drought, floods, storm, hail, cyclone or other extreme events. And in 2020, I'm only reporting on the most prevalent rates of natural disasters. On the basis of that, we have the B cohort, the 16 to 17-year-olds. The B is the birth cohort, and the K is the kindergarten cohort, who were 20 to 21 years of age at that particular time. And you can see here that the disaster exposure rates are very significant when we consider bushfires, particularly for the birth cohort members, but also for the kindergarten cohort members as well. Drought exposure is also quite high. Storm and hail, which one could consider to be less potentially a less traumatic experience, is also high as well, and flood is somewhat lower. Here what we do is we just look at the relationship between disaster exposure and a number and mental health as measured by the Kessler-10, which is a standardized, widely used measure of clinical levels of distress, and we're using a cutoff score here. So the first thing to note in this slide is the fact that we have very high rates of mental health across the board during the pandemic, and this is a national cohort study. So this is young people are doing it really tough in Australia, as they are also in the UK. And then the other thing to note is that there are statistically significant differences for bushfires, in particular for the K and the B cohort. This is predicted probabilities from a logistic regression model where we're controlling for a whole range of other demographic characteristics and mobility factors as well. So I guess the key point from this study really is that young people can report on disaster exposure from 16 years. These reports are associated with mental health outcomes, things that we care about, and it seems to replicate some of the findings from research in the Philippines that this information can be reported on in a relatively accurate fashion. I'm not reporting. We are doing additional validation work with linked geospatial information, which I'm not reporting on today, but I'm happy to come back and report on that information when we finish that piece of work. So we feel like the work that we've done gives us some confidence that natural disasters can be captured through self-report, that they are sensitive and probably more sensitive than geospatial linkage information, because there is quite a deal of variation in exposure, even within small geographic areas. And so this opens up lots of opportunities for how we might use this information to track and monitor disaster exposure in more real-time research that's going to rapidly inform policy and disaster responses. So next, I want to talk about a piece of work that we did following the 2019-20 bushfires, which many of you might be familiar with. I'll show you a map of it in a second, just to get a sense of how widespread the bushfires were at that period of time, largely due to increased drying across Australia. These bushfires occurred late in 2019. We used ANU poll, which uses a Life in Australia panel, which is an online probability panel, a representative online probability panel for population monitoring. And we were able to rapidly get a survey into the field, commenced in 20th January 2020. We continued for 2 weeks. We got 3,000 respondents, and we published a report within a few weeks of time, really documenting the extent of the bushfires. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Firstly, let me just show you, this is some national map, documenting the extent of fires for the 6 months for a year period across, which really highlights the fact that there was very widespread bushfires in that previous year, in that year that we've been surveying. And the other important point to note is that a lot of the population in Australia is around Melbourne, Sydney and Canberra and Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth, majority, and people tend to holiday around this area here, which is densely red. And that, we'll come back to that in a second. In this particular context, we asked a much more detailed question about exposure to bushfires. So we said, we'd like to ask you some questions about your experiences with bushfires, thinking about the bushfires that have occurred and are currently occurring over this spring and summer in Australia. Which of the following, if any, have you experienced? And we asked a series of questions really designed to capture the severity or the extent of people's not only exposure, but also the damage that's been done to them, from directly being impacted in terms of their home or property, to being threatened to have a family or friend have damage to their home and property, or threatened to being evacuated from an area by emergency services. So I was actually holidaying and was evacuated and slept in a church over New Year's Eve. So it was a very common experience with my family to be evacuated from travel experiences. Your travel or holiday itself changing or being affected by fires. We had very wide-ranging smoke across the southeast of Australia. There was very, very intensive smoke in the capital, Canberra, that broke all records. And then also we asked about people's experience about or concern and anxiety about fires as well. And this is weighted data. So we had very small numbers of people reporting direct damage, small percentage of the sample survey, 10%, actually quite a large number, reporting directly threatened and almost 2 in 5 reporting their family or friend threatened. And as I indicated before, wide-ranging smoke across the country, suggesting that very large proportions of the population were exposed to smoke, which has obvious health issues for some individuals. If we frame that in terms of what that looks like in terms of numbers of millions of people exposed, the first thing to note is that we're talking about a very large proportion of the population, so 15 million who had one or more of some form of exposure. And smoke exposure noteworthy as being one of the higher rates. We were worried when we saw this data because we thought that can't possibly be right. But we cross-validated this data with some other data collected by the Department of Tourism. They run a national visitors survey annually, which provides an estimate of the amount of visitors overnight. And when you put this out by month and averages out by month, then you're starting to get very high rates of people. And so we feel like these are quite relatively realistic estimates of the potential population who've been exposed. We use this data in subsequent work, but I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what we've done with this particular data, and also some of the challenges involved with using self-reports of disaster data. One of the things that I haven't mentioned and elaborated on sufficiently is really this idea of where someone resides isn't necessarily where they're exposed. So in the particular instance, we're referring to many Australians are on holidays at that time. This is our summer holidays. And so they're traveling far and wide across the country. So understanding the place of disaster exposure is as important as anything. And when we're wanting to track people over time, either in a short run or long-term longitudinal study, then we're also wanting to take into account residential mobility. So a lot of the work that we're doing is really looking at that in the cross-sectional regional and rural family study. We took into account those who've been moving over that 3-year period. And in the LSAC data, we have longitudinal data, so we know where people were previously, so we can track that as well. But it is a challenge in terms of using this data effectively. Next, I just want to touch on another way in which we've been trying to monitor something that's been impacting on everyone's lives all across the world, which is the pandemic. So the ANU Centre for Social Research has been using the Life in Australia, this National Probability online panel, to really monitor what's been going on in the population across a broad range of indicators. So we've run 8 sweeps since the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020. So almost every other week. And this has provided very valuable information for informing policies. Some of the data that we've collected, for example, on some of the income support policies, no one had at the time in which we collected it. So no government agency had this information. And so we were able to directly feed into policy for policymakers. This was subsequently funded by a number of departments because they represented the importance of this rapid turnaround here. what I'm showing below is a couple of graphs about transitions in vaccine intentions over from April 2021 to August 2021, looking at the changes in intentions with the rollout of Australia's vaccination rollout. Now, many of you may not know, but Australia's vaccination rollout was very slow in comparison to the UK. Our government struggled or did not get sufficient vaccines, and there was a scare about the AstraZeneca vaccine around the time of the commencement of the rollout, which meant that many more people than would have been otherwise were hesitant about taking the AstraZeneca vaccine. And so this has been a really big focus and piece of work for government, state and territory governments, and this work has been quite influential. So I just wanted to flag that I see this as being a potentially really important way in which we can really impact not just the impacts or exposures of the natural disasters over time, but also how that plays out in people's lives. Another way in which in real time across the pandemic, people have been tracking the impact of COVID-19 is through policy monitoring. So Oxford University have developed a government response tracker. I'm leading the Australian subnational data collection, primarily driven by frustration with not having nuanced enough geospatial data to be able to link to my survey data. And we're almost at the point where we'll be able to release information at the state and territory level for the major city in that particular state and territory and the region across the whole of the COVID-19 pandemic. That should be ready to roll in March next year. But that's not really, that's policy exposures for individuals, but it doesn't give you nuanced information about people's direct experiences at the small area geography. There's a Facebook Data for Good project, which provides more detailed population monitoring for some countries, relying on Facebook's broad reach. Whether that's a viable option, given the troubles that Facebook are experiencing currently, I'm not sure. But the idea behind it of having large-scale, rapid mechanisms to collect information about natural disasters, people's responses to them, and for governments to be able to, and also the public to understand what's going on, I think is really important and has been underscored by this particular pandemic. So I want to sort of close by saying, if nothing else, if you take nothing else from my presentation, consider including some self-reports of natural disasters. The work that we've done suggests that they are reliable and sensitive measures of disaster exposures. They provide additional information over and above geospatial linked data. We feel that they're much more sensitive than linked data, and also consider the role of real-time tracking and monitoring disasters. I know many of you are doing a variety of different sample surveys, online panels, and other types of work. And I'd just be strongly encouraging you to think about including that, because it's actually quite rare to have social scientists doing work in this area. So I'm going to stop there at 22 and allow people to ask some questions. You can contact me, and I'll just stop sharing.
Thanks, Ben. That was a really great presentation. Yeah, and bang on time. So yeah, lots of interesting topics there. I don't think there's any questions in the Q&A yet, but I'll give people a couple of minutes to post any questions you have. They have, and we can ask you I just one thing for me, maybe just to start while people are maybe writing questions. It was really impressive, I thought, for the bushfires study, kind of how quickly that was done. And I think you said you sort of produced a report within a few weeks of field work. And I guess similarly with some of the COVID-19, it's been quite sort of quick turnaround. I guess having something like the Life in Australia panel is a really great resource for that. I seem sort of without that, it would take longer to get these things off the ground and kind of set up studies, and it wouldn't be as easy to track things as quickly.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. And ESS has the Kronos project, which is about setting up a online representative panel study, and I guess I'm a big fan of that. There are some challenges with those sorts of studies in terms of keeping the same participants involved. But I guess one of the really powerful things that's come out from us, from our work, and for us from the COVID monitoring series, is just the importance of having longitudinal data on a large population, a large sample of individuals, but also being able to field a survey very quickly, get data very quickly, and then produce a report very quickly. So we've been able to do that much more quickly than, say, our National Statistics Agency, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. However, I should also note that they have also been very relatively agile for them in the wake of the pandemic, using getting information quite rapidly, and they also fielded their own household online panel after we started ours, and we're doing monthly surveys tracking the population in a similar sort of way. So I can see these types of surveys as being really important responses and infrastructure to have in place for nations to be able to really understand what's going on in their populations and to be able to respond quickly.
Great, thank you. We've got a question in actually now, so I'll read it out. This is from Siobhan. So it strikes me that some of the populations that are hardest to reach and retain in surveys could be especially adversely affected by natural disasters, or less able to rebuild, etc. Have you taken particular approaches to capture such populations, or was this not really a concern?
That's a great question, Siobhan, and it's always a challenge. That the most disadvantaged are always the hardest to reach. So it is a concern, and I would say, broadly speaking, we've taken different approaches in our work. So in the rural and regional family study, where we had a specific focus for our work, we oversampled people in regional and rural areas. And you might not think that they're disadvantaged, but actually in Australia, there's far more poverty in regional areas than there is in the major cities, because the employment is so much less available. But the advantage with interviewing people who are in regional areas, in Australia at least, is that they also want to talk. So that's good. But for other groups, so for example, in Australia, our Indigenous population, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups, it's very hard to engage with them. There's a long history of statistics and government surveys or university-based surveys demonising or being used to demonise this particular group. So it's a real challenge to get them to be engaged and for them to see the value in the data. Colleagues have been doing work with these populations largely through having Indigenous-led surveys and so on. So with respect to rapidly responding to natural disasters, then it's a bit trickier. But if we were to set up a resource or an infrastructure that was for the nation or for the UK, then you might want to think about how you have a nuanced set of communication strategies, and also a bit of agency for particular minority groups in how the information's used, what questions get asked in the first place, some sort of controls around that. So there's a bit of agency around that, because that's been a very big issue for our Indigenous population in Australia. So that's a long-winded answer to your rather short question. But yeah, certainly a concern. In the Filipino case, so in that case, I didn't talk a lot about the survey methodology, but I'll talk a little bit about it. So they had a very high response rate. Initially, they had people going into barangays, going into villages. This sounds pretty straightforward in the UK context. In the Philippines, this is not straightforward in some areas. There are there are separatist Muslim areas in some which are run by freedom fighters. There are where you get in fear of your life. So it is challenging to get in there to do the surveys, but the teams who are involved on the ground have had a long history in working in these areas. So they had the 3 demographic research institutes doing the surveys in the Philippines, and so they were very successful in being able to engage. And we had a very large portion of Indigenous peoples, because there are multiple Indigenous peoples in the Philippines as a result.
Thanks, Ben. Please do type any more questions that people have. I don't think there's anything else there at the moment. Just again, while we're waiting, Ben, are you aware of similar studies being done sort of elsewhere in the world? Obviously, you've talked about a few examples you're involved in, but obviously there's different parts of the world where there's natural disasters. Is this something that's being done kind of elsewhere, as far as you know?
No, that's exactly why I wanted to talk about it, actually. There's very limited data that's being collected on this in terms of self-reported data. And I guess what I'm advocating for is for people to, COVID-19 is an exception, of course, but for other types of disaster exposures, there's actually really limited information in these large-scale surveys. There's obviously decisions that need to be made about prioritizing data, but I think the sort of survey infrastructure that, say, the ESS is building, where you have these online panels where you're able to track people's exposures and then look at the outcomes down the track, even if it's in the short run, potentially offer a real opportunity to be able to get more insights into how people are reacting to these sorts of events. So I'm quite bullish on the prospects for the future, but really for a long time we've been working, as far as we're aware, and I don't know how many times I've searched the literature, but many, in more or less isolation on this particular topic. So it's actually quite not very few people are doing work in this area. There are specific surveys that have been developed for a specific disaster, but more broadly, thinking about a broad sweep and over the life course, very limited work as far as we're aware.
Sure. I guess it'll be interesting to see maybe if the pandemic has any longer term impact on that, because a big sort of feature of the pandemic in terms of surveys is very quickly sort of adapting current surveys, coming up with new surveys to capture this huge event, and I'm sure it will continue in terms of the longer term impacts of that event. So I guess it's a similar principle to natural disasters. So maybe that, I guess, sort of culture change might sort of impact more broadly beyond the pandemic.
I think so. And I think that aid agencies and development agencies as well are increasingly thinking about these sorts of things. I think we have to learn from there's been good practice and not so good practice in response to the pandemic. And so what I think we probably do need to do is very much push for having these larger scale representative surveys that we can, that infrastructure in place, I guess. And so I think that's really important moving forward.
Great, thank you. I see there's one more question from Felicia. So thanks for your presentation. Did you also ask people about whether they consider themselves at risk of particular natural disasters in addition to asking about exposure? Is this something you might consider doing in the future?
That's an excellent question, Felicia. And one of I had so many figures. One of the things that we did ask in our COVID monitoring survey, every wave actually was, or almost every wave was, how likely do you think you are of to be contracting COVID-19? So that's an example of where we did do that. But I can understand why you might ask that when you're thinking about disaster exposures and thinking about residential mobility and thinking about people's decision making about whether they would live in a particular area. When there might be some particular areas in a particular city that are more at risk than others. So we've been doing some other work where, because we have longitudinal data in the Philippines, we can do some lagged models where we look at previous exposures and then look at changes in exposure as a way to sort of get around those sorts of things as well. And we'll continue to do that work. But yeah, it's a really good question. And I think we can probably learn a lot. We in terms of looking at fears around getting COVID-19, that was actually a really important variable in our vaccination work, looking at hesitancy and resistance. So we did some statistical modeling, looking at correlates of hesitancy and resistance and fear of getting the vaccine, fear of getting COVID-19. And remember, the context is very different in the UK. We had extremely low rates, particularly early on, was a really significant predictor of what people intended to do and what they actually did end up doing in terms of being vaccinated. So important variable to measure.
Thanks, Ben. So we've got about 5 minutes to go, so still time for one more question. If anyone has anything, please do type it in the Q&A. I don't know if you had any closing thoughts, Ben. I mean, I guess if anyone here is interested in collecting data like this themselves on their studies, then you're very happy for them to get in touch with you to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. My closing thoughts are, please get in touch if you do want to collect this sort of information. And of course, I'm also very much in favour of the ESS collecting some information on mixed disasters exposures as well as a potential module. Although I probably don't want to go through all the rigmarole it entails in terms of making an application. Very happy for someone else to take the lead on that. But certainly something that I think would be worthwhile considering in the context of climate change. We know that there will be increased disasters in people's lives, and we know that that's going to happen. It's a matter of timing rather than whether it will ever happen. And so understanding what that looks like across Europe would be a terrific topic. So sure. That's my closing statement.
Yeah, definitely be a very interesting topic. There will be a call for rotating modules it'll be round 12 coming out early next year. So
okay, great.
That'll be fieldwork in 2025. So I mean, not quite as quick turnaround as some of the stuff you talked about today, but yeah. Cool. All right.
All right.
Unless there's any more questions, then doesn't look like there's anything else coming in. So I think we can wrap up. So thanks very much to Ben for a really great presentation, and as I said, for giving up part of your evening there. And thanks to everyone for joining. Yeah, have a great rest of the day. Those of you who start the day, have a great evening, Ben and anyone else in that part of the world. I'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming along. Bye, guys.
Bye.